Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. Today, I have my good friend, the Reverend Dr. Patrick Dunn, joining the program. Patrick is a good friend of mine from seminary, and he's here to talk about the decline of Christianity in the West and the rise of global Christianity in the South. So, before we begin, Patrick, just good to see you, man. How are you? How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. It's great to be with you. This is a pleasure. We don't get enough chances to catch up, so this is awesome.
Yeah, no, secretly, that's why I love this podcast, is I get to catch up with some old friends and just to have conversations that I don't normally have, especially with COVID around the corner. It's like, you can't just go have conversations with strangers anymore. You have to you have to be intentional about creating them. So it's so good to have you, man. How you been? Where are you right now?
So I'm at home in New Haven, Connecticut. I am a pastor for Discipleship at a church called Elm Street Vineyard Church in New Haven, Connecticut. So yeah, I'm at home. We are living this normal pandemic life, I suppose. We are also, like many churches, trying to figure out how to care for and love our people in the midst of being online, coming back in person, trying to figure out how to do that safely and wisely and honor what God is doing in our midst. So we're doing well, but well with like the big asterisk that everybody is experiencing of well, and also it's a lot right now. It's a big challenge.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But prior to coming back to the States, were you in South Africa, or Germany? Which one was it? I forget.
That's true. So I've been a pastor of this church for about 3 years. Prior to that, I was in Germany for a year trying to finish up a PhD in theology. Before that, I was in South Africa for about 5 years as a pastor affiliated with the Uniting Presbyterian Church in Southern Africa. So these are Presbyterians in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia that are all under one denomination together. So I served in those churches. That was immediately after seminary. So before that, I was at Princeton with you, Haig.
Yeah, the good old days.
The good old days.
Wow. So you actually spent time. I mean, you're from America. In what state? Indiana, correct? Or
That's right. I grew up in Indiana. So yes, I'm entirely white bread Middle American, and yet have been blessed to have a lot of opportunities to travel and to live all over the world.
yeah, I'm always shocked about the Indiana Pacers, how they always like consecutively are a good team. Like they always make the playoffs. I know you're a huge Pacers fan.
I I am. We have for so much of my life we have struggled right at that, like just barely making the playoff. Not enough to like win a championship, not good enough to win a championship, but not bad enough to like get a number 1 draft pick. So
Yeah,
we
it's
just press on. We press on.
I feel like they've been the most consistent team since like I started following the NBA with that. Just like good enough to make the playoffs. Anyway,
Yeah.
we digress. So okay, so you had this experience growing up in the middle of America. You did quite some time ministry in South Africa and spent time in Germany. So how would you characterize like your experience as, just before we jump into like the bigger data trends, just like the personal trend of like how was it doing ministry in America versus doing ministry in South Africa? Where were some of the differences? What were some of the similarities?
That's a really good question. Uh, I think that there might have been a part of me when I first started going to South Africa. I was at a place, even when we met, Haig, like when I was beginning seminary, I was at a place of being a little bit burnt out on some parts of the American evangelical church in particular, and in some of its blind spots in relation to justice, to things that seemed like a part of God's kingdom work that just were not apparent in what the church was doing. I think maybe naively, like I perceived at first, being a part of it, churches in Africa in particular, as somehow being more authentic. I don't think in the end that was precisely true. I don't think that there can be similar. There can be African churches can have their own kinds of hypocrisies. There are ways in which like grace and sin are constantly at work in all kinds of different churches in very similar ways. But what was unique and what was profound for me, I think, was just particularly for where I was at in South Africa, like to be exposed to some of people's most immediate needs: poverty, crime, the AIDS epidemic, a water crisis, a drought, tuberculosis. Like there was a huge number of different challenges that were landing on the church's doorstep constantly, and that fact alone sort of forced the many churches, in my experience, to just like really take stock of what it would mean to follow God in relation to some of the least of these. And often these churches were filled with people who were also the least of these. And so there was like a sense of not necessarily a greater authenticity, but just a greater invitation from God to like see the life of Jesus lived out. And that was a powerful thing in Africa.
Wow. Yeah, I think, I mean, so pretty much the big thesis of our conversation is like, there's numbers that are showing this tremendous decline of Christianity from the Europe, North America, and a giant increase this past century in the rise of Christians from places like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And I'm wondering if a lot of it has to do with this economic thing where like the first will be last and the last will be first, getting to a point where we're so comfortable, so self-reliant. We have all the resources in the West where there's no reliance on God whatsoever, versus other parts of the world when it's just, it's either I need God to survive versus God as an option. I don't. What are your thoughts on that link? I'm just trying to flesh this out a bit.
I think that really gets me thinking. I think, I mean, certainly if we approach the question of Christianity and its relationship to either West or sort of global South, if we approach that question from the perspective of like sociologists, we look at numbers, we look and see that there are, for instance, now in the US, there are 26% of people respond to surveys. In the most recent data I saw, as 26% respond in what the category that they now call just nuns, which would include NONES, which would include
not the Catholic nuns.
Who are not the Catholic nuns. Yeah. People who that's just a catch-all for like people who would be considered themselves atheists or agnostic, or would just say that they have no really religious conviction in general. That 26% is about 9% higher than it was a decade ago. So 17% to 26%. And correspondingly, like the number of people that call themselves Christians has declined from by about 12 points. And so we look at things like that and we say, well, that seems to suggest a certain trajectory for what the future of Christianity in the West. Simultaneously, we look at the rest of the world, and Christianity is exploding in many parts of the world. Christianity is 1 out of every 4 Christians in the world right now is in Africa. And there are estimates that could be like as many as 2 out of 5, 40% of Christians by the year 2030 could be in Africa. There are some people who, it's hard to get good data on this, but like there are some people who would argue quite seriously, I think, that it's quite likely that there are more Christians worshiping in China on a given Sunday than there are in the whole of the United States these days, in small house churches, all kinds of different situations. So we look at that and we say, like, there seems to be something going on there. Maybe what we could call a kind of decline of Christianity in the West, what we could also call just a shift of Christianity towards Latin America, Africa, Asia, that is sort of where the center and future of Christianity lies. And I think it does raise for us exactly what you're saying, Hag, of these really interesting questions. I mean, that's the sort of sociologist's perspective. For me as a pastor, I often think, I'm not always convinced, I guess, that the numbers tell the whole story. I think that the life of following Jesus has never been extremely popular. It's never been particularly easy, and it's never been something that has been widely embraced. And I think that sort of authentic Christian life in pursuit of Jesus is doing about as well in the West as it ever has been. What is less, what we see less of is sort of a broader kind of cultural incentive to identify as Christian, or to see sort of either the Christian church as representing a kind of cultural value that you hold, or as maybe just a kind of your primary social setting or primary point of connection with other people. And so some of that I think is related to what you're saying, that there is a part of what is happening in the global South is a real thriving opportunity for people to see and experience what God is doing in relation to some really challenging circumstances sometimes, and to look for hope, to look for an authenticity of expression that speaks to them and where they are at. Some of it also, and this is like where even African Christianity can have some of its places of hypocrisy. Some of that also begins to look like their own kinds of state churches forming in different countries. So for instance, the previous president of South Africa, where I lived for a while, was a man named Jacob Zuma, and he had a formal sort of council of pastors in the ways that you would expect maybe people to call on the bishops of mainline churches. But instead of mainline churches, they were like the pastors of some of the largest kind of mega churches, prosperity churches in South Africa, that in a sense were now functioning as a kind of like state, or a state sanctioned sort of body of approval, a group of people saying, at least acting as if they could say on behalf of God, like, we approve of what you are doing as the leader of the state. And that also includes, like, there is some of that going on as well, that part of what is happening in Africa is just that there are going to be many more Africans as a percentage of global population in the future. And many of them will grow up in Christian cultures, and that will be real for them as well.
Wow. Wow. You mentioned the prosperity gospel. I mean, I think, is this an export of America going over to the rest of the world? It's because it's instead of it's like twisted form of Christianity being exported, especially for those who have nothing. What was your encounter? You encounter that in South Africa or any of your research?
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, even to like think of it as an American export. There is some truth to that. The largest church in South Africa, in fact, one of the largest churches in the world, they will claim up to 15 million members, but we know for sure that they have at least 3 million. Is called the Zion Christian Church, headquartered in South Africa. The Zion in Zion Christian Church does not stand for the Holy Land. It's a Zion that refers to a town called Zion, Illinois, which was a place where a kind of faith healer, medium, prosperity preacher named John Alexander Dowie started a ministry, and then to sort of like foster and cultivate the prosperity he was gaining, he basically planted a town and was both pastor and sort of like the Lord over this town. And then that kind of prosperity church began to plant other churches all over the world, planted some churches in South Africa in the early 20th century. And then those churches, under the leadership of a man named Ingenas Lekganyene, he was also a prosperity preacher who just was actually far more successful than this John Alexander Dowie had ever been, and created an enormously large church. So a lot of people from the West, I think, part of their first encounter with global South Christianity often does happen to be through the lens of of a prosperity churches and this prosperity gospel. I think that we often, because that's our first encounter with it, we often assume that is that we're looking for like some reasons to figure out why why would the church in the global south be prone to this in a way, but in actual fact, like, we are equally as prone in the West to the prosperity gospel, and in fact we have multiplied it in many ways.
I was not expecting you to actually talk about a specific minister from Illinois. You're literally bringing it over. That's hysterical.
I mean, I would meet occasionally. Like, I remember running into a guy in Lagos, which is a city in Nigeria, at the airport. A fellow, like the only other white guy in my vicinity, who was an American, and we struck up a conversation, and he was a pastor. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. Like, where's your church? And he didn't really have one. He was just like he was like a pastor who was an American who was making like quite a good living from traveling all over Africa to different prosperity churches, kind of preaching as a guest preacher, and kind of firing them up with these sorts of revivals that would bring in more money. And I think what was particularly challenging for me, though, as I spent more time in prosperity gospel churches, and I still think about this often, was to just realize that when I was around them, what was in a way most shocking to me was to find that there were some people in those churches who were just really faithful followers of Jesus. Like, were just extraordinarily genuine in their faith, even sort of while their church was almost like actively trying to lead them astray at times. And that has really, ever since then, that has really like made me even wrestle a little bit with how I think about the church, and even sort of church as the guardian of the gospel in some way, in relation to what God is doing in the lives of ordinary people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an amazing point. And you could replace prosperity preacher to a preacher who has a scandal, has fallen into sin. I mean, like right now, like in America, we've had those scandals with like Ravi Zacharias and Carl Lentz in the city. That doesn't mean like their whole ministry is like to be thrown out of the bad water, but it's still wrong and evil what especially like Zacharias did and Carl Lentz. But like, not to put any pastor under the bus, but like it's very common for these pastors to lead people astray, or maybe they've been falling in sins in a certain way, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the rest of the church or most of the church. I don't know. It's good to think about. I think sometimes we may place too much pressure on the pastors, and then sometimes we create models where we want these celebrity pastors, and we kind of elevate the pastor to a really twisted and bizarre perspective, and it always leads to some sort of toxic culture where whenever one specific individual is lifted up in any church setting, it always gets weird in some way. And sometimes it's prosperity gospel, sometimes it's just, oh, this person's such a good teacher, or he's entertaining, but if that becomes the focal point of a church, it stops becoming a church.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it does, like, it feeds off of itself sometimes. I mean, we as pastors, there's a sinful part of us that like maybe loves that or is fed by that in a bad sort of way, but also there is a part of churches sometimes that long for that kind of like a figurehead, someone that they could put on a pedestal. There's something about us as Christians that maybe sometimes projects that onto people, and the more that we project that on the people, the harder it is for them to bear, the more that they both kind of don't love it and also live with it and are kind of addicted to it, and then it sort of all falls apart in these really awful public ways.
Yeah. You have any additional data? Because it's not just Africa here. This movement is manifesting itself in different forms in different parts of the world. Like you mentioned, China being a house church movement. You know, it's the opposite of this megachurch setup It's more of like literally the local churches are meeting in secret in houses. And that's why it's hard to get actual numbers, because it's all underground. But there's this multiplication effect of, all right, we're going to use your house now to be a church. What is some of the other data you have before we jump into other parts of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. It is extremely difficult to get great data on some of the house church stuff, particularly in China, where it's probably most prevalent. I think our best estimates are that they're probably closing in. So Africa would be slightly ahead of Asia right now in terms of just total number of Christians, but only slightly. That there's probably as many as closing in on 500 million Christians in Asia, almost 500 million. And that so far, from what we can tell over the 20th century, that the Christian community in Asia has been growing at twice the rate that just the general population in Asia has been growing. And a lot of that, you're right, has been happening, particularly in China, through much smaller gatherings and through much more interpersonal contact. There are some mega churches, Singapore, South Korea, like there are some extraordinarily large Asian churches, but a lot of where the gospel began in many places, and certainly where it's beginning in parts of Asia that don't have much of a Christian background or Christian heritage in any respect, begins with this like interpersonal, these house churches, this like disciple making, just as you see in the gospel, that happens one-to-one in small groups, that is about a kind of like intimate experience to which God speaks into a laying on of hands, a multiplication of the Holy Spirit that then later manifests into like larger and larger gatherings of folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And like some of these mega churches are not all prosperity gospel either. There's some really good mega churches that make sure there's small groups, there's actual discipleship. And I think, I mean, there's also different cultural aspects to it too, and how people worship that we have to consider, because each country, each culture has some sort of like things that work and don't work. And I think part of the beauty of this whole movement, it's like we're talking about multiple cultures, multiple different economic positions. So it's hard to just like put one thing on it, like I was trying to. I think it's a fool's thing. But you mentioned that it has to be multiple things at play with the rise of the global South.
Absolutely, and like to be clear, I'm definitely not an expert on global South Christianity nor on African Christianity, and partly I say that just because I'm not sure anyone could be an expert on them. They are a multiplicity of a huge number of different things happening simultaneously, and some of them. And the question for us, for Christians in those places, and for us who want to come alongside of them, is how to like foster the best of what the Spirit is doing there, and to avoid some of the pitfalls that we ourselves have fallen into at times in the West, which is a different sort of thing maybe than just asking, for particular paradigms or sizes of churches or whatever. It is actually ultimately asking about like where do we see real life? Where do we see real of God's own life, giving life to people in these different places?
And I know you're super observant, and I mean, you were just saying earlier how you're like partly during seminary, you're fed up with a lot of the hypocrisy you see in America. What are some of the other pitfalls that you kind of get on that you notice that contradict the life of Christ?
Oh man, Hygo, I could go on and on.
I'm asking you to just go on a rant, please.
I mean, I don't. I can't really speak for something called the American church necessarily any more than I can speak for the African church. But I can identify in some of my own experience, particularly being around growing up in a very small town in kind of the rural, almost entirely white Midwest, that there are just ways in which what ends up being true for everyone is that we permit our churches to replicate some of the blind spots that our societies already contain. And we often tend to value churches as places that will uphold for us a particular way of life. And for us, for many white American Christians, like that has become a place where we see our faith as primarily upholding a certain sense of identity for us. Could be with respect to our country, with respect to our race, with respect to economic status, and all of those things first and foremost, like it's very hard to draw from the life of a God who gave his own son up to the cross for us. It's very hard to draw from the life of Jesus a real clear sense that God is simply interested in preserving our way of life for any of us. There is something that Jesus comes, he finds people who are living a certain way of life all over the place, and he often draws them out of it into something that looks quite new, even quite risky for them. And some of that then ultimately, like for us, undermines some of like the things that we have taken to be most obviously true. I mean, I think some of the obvious things that pop up is just our materialism, our sort of love of way in which we casually assume that we ought to simply ascend some kind of ladder, whether that is career or financial or social, that we have not, for instance, stood against the forces of American culture that tend to segregate our communities. We have, whether we intended to or not, we have very casually just followed along with kind of moving our families up to the bigger houses in the nicer neighborhoods with the fancier jobs. And so we certainly do not look, the Church in America does not generally look much like God's multi-ethnic kingdom. Like we don't resemble always in our gatherings, the kinds of gatherings that will happen in God's presence in the future. And we are just not very attentive to some of the people that suffer the most both in our midst and abroad. And all of those things, to me, are the opposite of what Jesus exemplifies.
Yeah, absolutely. I especially for like those Americans who have never traveled to impoverished areas of the world, I really think like every person needs to do that, just to have a sobering understanding of the scale of poverty that exists. I mean, yes, there's poverty in America, but I mean, I know you've done ministry in very dire circumstances, and it's just like all Americans are privileged with the amount of resources and luxuries we have, all of us, and I think it's quite scary to know that we're going to be responsible for how we use our resources, and are we aware that we are in a state where we can actually do a lot, but if we're just caught up with our own sort of drama and not thinking big picture or thinking about other people, like you're saying, we're more focused about climbing that career ladder than serving the kingdom of God. It gets really murky and tricky, and it gets twisted. The gospel gets twisted, and I think that's how you get these prosperity gospels emerging. Whether it's financial from America or these prosperity gospels that are not about money, but they're more about like, all right, if I serve God, all my career ambitions are going to be fulfilled. Everything I want is going to happen. And that's like goes against Christianity. It's not your will be done. It's God's will be done. Follow me, not Lord, follow me. And this leads to really twisted forms of Christianity that are exactly opposite. But we kind of just like you were hinting at, like we get comfortable and we just go with our ways, and then we take a look at it and there's nothing special about this Christianity. It's just normal living with a Christian stamp on it.
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger right on it. I think I even having lived back in the U.S. for the last few years, I came back to the U.S. after some years away, and when I returned, I was married to a wife that I love very much, who is from Costa Rica, and she had never lived in the U.S. before. So seeing even our life, our lifestyle, our culture through her eyes in the last few years has just only opened up for me more places where like I was tempted to take a lot of things for granted, that I was just not even, I mean, the places where sin creeps into our life most often is not always the places where we know very clearly that we are facing a temptation and we are trying to figure out how to overcome it. Places where sin really gets to us is the places where we realize we don't even think that there's a choice being asked of us at all. Like we just have not even realized, we are just going along and kind of going with the flow. And a lot of that is precisely for what you're saying, is that it's a reflection of we go along quite easily with whatever seems to be benefiting us, and in that way we betray something of like how we have put ourselves on a throne at the center of our lives. We betray that we have made idols out of our own selves and our welfare, our lifestyles, what seems normal to us. And so among the things that traveling could do, but you don't have to travel necessarily to have your eyes open to what to the fact that God is much, much bigger than the things that you might assume to be true of your life or of God. And that actually is a gift to us, even though it can be a little bit frightening to suddenly realize, oh man, I can't take nearly as much for granted as I did before. Not even the fact that I ought to have a house or a steady income, or even, as Jesus would tell us, like not even that could take for granted that I have a place to lay my head at night.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, I think part of this too is why a lot of those nuns that you mentioned, those who don't identify, they tend to be younger. They tend to see these hypocrisies, and they want nothing to do with the church, because of a lot of the stuff we were even talking about. And it's interesting how that's increasing in America. It's already drastically increased in Europe. And it's going to be interesting to see if America is going to fall like Europe when it comes to numbers with Christianity. We were seeing different forms of Christianity rising in the South. I mean, there's a Catholic Pentecostal type emerging in various parts of South America. You have the southern parts of Africa, and then you have the various Asian cultures. Like South Korea is a fascinating study. And they're a country that's pretty good economically, and how quickly the past century, like over half the country became Christian. And I know like there's part of the Korean culture is they pray every morning, they gather at church. I think there's something powerful there with prayer that we tend to not talk about. And then you have other models of growth. But it's interesting too, before like Europe and white Christianity became a thing, like people forget that Christianity originated in the Middle East and that the early hubs of Christianity were Jerusalem, the Cappadocian, Central Turkey, North Africa, and then they had their fall, and then it moved to Europe, and then you had persecuted Christians coming to America, and now it's like coming full circle. It's very fascinating that this is not just the first shift of this. There's been multiple shifts of the rises and falls of Christianity.
It is I mean, it was a bit of a landmark. It seemed like a landmark in around 1980. It seems like the demographics shifted to the point where there was more Christians in the global South than there was in the West, and it's only that percentage, that ratio has only been continuing to tilt. But that was a landmark shift in 1980, but not because the Christian church had always been that way. It had only been that way for about 1,000 years or so, because there had been almost a millennium before that, where certainly like global South Christians were more numerous than European or European descendant Christians. And if anything, to me, like this is all just reason to, I don't worry much for the future of the church in any place. And if anything, like this is room for a lot of excitement, as you're pointing out, even in your example of Korea. Like we're only going to, if 100 years from now, the real center of the Christian church is in Shanghai, we are only going to be like, we're going to be immensely blessed by that. We're going to be immensely blessed to discover what more God is doing in all sorts of different cultures, traditions, people's histories and stories. That's going to be just exciting and a really rich thing. And if there's a part of us that feels some anxiety about that, that's a thing to bring back to God, and to just ask what else we are privileging there over and above the real advance of the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also love like, there's also like other cultures, like I'm Armenian, you come from a Catholic, Irish background, right, Patrick?
That's right.
It's
Yeah.
St. Patrick's Day, happy St. Patrick's Day. But there's also like, there's always these like subgroups or remnants like that, like no matter what persecution we may have faced as a people, like, yeah, we're still Christ followers. And there's always those outliers too, to all this, which is always fascinating.
Absolutely. Even for us in the West, even if Christianity was to become, I mean, it's not remotely close to being sort of in a place of actual persecution, but even if it was, like, there is something that can be really difficult but rich and clarifying for us in our own experience. And I think that's part of what you've seen in the Armenian people's history. I mean, I'd be curious to hear more of what you think about, not to put you entirely on the spot, and maybe you've talked about this at length before, but this sensibility of Armenia as Christian nation, and the way in which, like, something that God has done has really been preserved in that, and also the ways in which there is even still sometimes like a remnant within a Christian nation that has to be preserved. I don't know if that matches your sense of it, but I'd be really curious to hear what's going on there.
Totally. I mean, I'm an Armenian Protestant for a reason, because you always want moments of reformation. Not that you're trying to create something brand new. It's just you want to revisit the core stuff. So like the Armenian evangelical movement started to get the Bible in the vernacular language so that people could reclaim their traditions and understand what the why behind them. And you have that oftentimes where over time they become cultural norms without understanding the why behind them, and then it could turn into weird legalism. So yeah, there's definitely that throughout the history, but there's this also perseverance and like promise of God that kind of upholds it. Like, it doesn't make sense why Armenians still are Christian, like considering all the persecution we've endured, but it's just forged us to hold on to this important thing, and that God has a plan for the nations. And I think we have to have a more biblical understanding of that word, because I think when the Bible speaks of nations, it's not talking about borders, it's actually talking about family trees and genetic patterns. So I always view like nation groups more of a diaspora or wherever they are versus the land, even though there is theology of land and that's important. But I think that's an important aspect in all this, to also view a biblical idea of nation, not connected to the land. So the Israelites didn't have the land, but they were still a nation, right? That sort of understanding of is more biblical than I think than these man-made borders. So that's
certainly, and I would include even what you're describing in terms of like family trees, and even like a shared sense of story and of history. I mean, I think that there is a way in which the Armenian church, as an example, has and like can continue to be renewed by the story of the gospel in its own history, like in its own can be in a sense reformed by its own story and the example of what God has done in the past. And that will continue to be true for us as American Christians as well. There is a possibility, not that we will have to just kind of throw our hands up in the air and say, well, I guess Christianity just doesn't belong to these shores anymore, but that we can actually hope for and expect a reformation in a way that looks back to what God has really done and wants to point out to us in our own story as a people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have that hope for this country because of its history, because of the revivals, because a lot of persecuted Christian groups came to find freedom here, that there's a lot to reclaim here. if we understand our history as Americans too, that need to be revisited. And it's quite beautiful when the best parts of American Christianity are there versus the negatives that we were talking about. So I share your optimism. That of course there needs to be some sort of wake up in America right now. And I think part of the beauty of it, like just being a pastor in New York City, the churches that are really like holding it together seem to be the ethnic churches. And that's the part of America, right? You have like people coming here for freedom of worship, freedom of new opportunities. And we're one of the few places in the world where we could actually have that church where you have all the nations gathered, because we are here, versus other parts where it's much of the same. So there's definitely something to be hopeful about, and I think it's going to happen. But I think if the church doesn't own up to the hypocrisies and call it sin and not wake up and not think from a bigger perspective, it's going to head the nuns number is going to just increase. But we'll see what happens. God is in charge, right?
Amen to that. Amen to that.
All right. Thank you, Patrick Dunn, the Reverend Dr. Patrick Dunn. Happy St. Patrick's Day to those who are celebrating. Please do not sin in your celebration, but have a good time. And thanks for watching, and tune in to the next episode of Christ and Coffee. God bless you, and thank you for listening.